So welcome back to 11-minute lessons. This year we're going to go through the books of 1st and 2nd Peter and then Jude. A chance to for this group to dig into one book of the Bible throughout the year, kind of go verse by verse, learn their larger context and how chapter 1 speaks to chapter 4, because so often we get to pull little things out of different books, but you don't get the big picture. So even if you miss a week, you can always catch it online. You can email me. I'll send you a copy of the sheets. You can really follow through. So today we're kind of introducing why 1st and 2nd Peter. So why 1st and 2nd Peter? In part because these are letters that as a whole, they don't get studied very often. You may have occasionally heard a verse pulled out at a funeral or preached on, but chances are you haven't really studied these letters in their entirety. Anybody ever really study and read through 1st and 2nd Peter? Jude? No? So why are we studying them together? The obvious answer is that because they're grouped together in our New Testament scriptures. They both bear the name of Peter as the author, 1 Peter 1:1 and 2 Peter 1:1. And the second Peter speaks of an earlier letter. It says, "This is now, beloved, the second letter I am writing you." But the relationship may not be as clear as it may seem at first glance. A lot of scripture is like that. What things may look like at a first reading, at first glance on the surface, is not what you find when you look a little longer and you dig a little deeper. So the signature on these two letters are different. The first is signed Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ, while the second is from Simeon Peter, a servant and apostle of Jesus Christ. This is a rare occurrence of the work Simeon, or Simeon with a Y, to refer to the apostle we know as Simon Peter. The only other reference appears in Acts 15:14 in a speech by James, the brother of Jesus. This doesn't mean the letters were authored by different individuals. Sometimes we may choose to sign our name differently, but it does make us wonder. It was not at all atypical for individuals to take on a historic persona when writing. It wasn't seen as a lie, but as a tribute. It's something we'll consider as we study these letters. We've talked about that before. Chances are not all of the books, the letters in the New Testament attributed to Paul were written by Paul. Most likely by some of his students, kind of taking on his mantle, keeping his teaching, his way of things alive. The Gospel of John, 1st, 2nd, 3rd John, and Revelation are all grouped as Johannine literature, but probably not written by the same person because of the length of time, the different dates of that writing, but clearly from the same school of thought. So they're kind of maybe as students of John, again, writing in his name. There's an old Middle Ages book that's attributed to a guy named Dionysius the Areopagite, who appears in the book of Acts. Now, this was written like 1,200 years after Dionysius would have died, but he chose that name for a particular reason. So it's not at all odd for people to take the name of someone else when writing. So it's important to kind of know that. Likewise, the readers of the letters are addressed differently. The first letter is sent to the exiles of the dispersion in Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. The second is written to those who have received a faith as precious as ours. Furthermore, when the second letter reminds the reader of the content of the former, the reference corresponds only in a broad and general way to one of the themes of 1 Peter. This could and most likely means that 2 Peter refers to a prior letter that we no longer possess. So it's not that they're coming one right after the other. It might have been different authors responding to very different letters. Unfortunately, we don't have both ends of the correspondence. It's kind of like with Paul's letters. I'd love to read what he was responding to sometimes, because that's important. In Scripture, often we struggle to know what's universal and what's prescriptive to a particular time and place. For instance, in one of Paul's writings, you may remember he talks about, women should stay silent in church. Now, is that all women everywhere in every church? Or, as many scholars think, there's a situation going on at that church where some prophetesses were coming in, sharing heresies. He's kind of saying, these women shouldn't be speaking, kind of keep them quiet. It's kind of like if a bunch of dogs came into the church and were eating the cushions and biting people, and I made a pronouncement in the newsletter, dogs are not allowed in church. It's in reference to a thing going on here. Now, 2,000 years from now, if somebody really thinks my writings are that great, God forbid that would ever be the case, and says, we can't allow dogs in church anymore because they don't understand what was happening. They just see the notice dogs aren't allowed in church. We don't have all the information, which we'll more of that in a second. So you may have heard of apocryphal writings or gospels. It's one of the current rages in religious publishing. People write books about the lost gospels or the forbidden gospels or whatever sensational title they can come up with. The reality is that we, and I mean Christian scholars in the world today, are in possession of a number of writings, whole or fragmentary, that may not be in the New Testament for one or another multiple reasons. The reasons are many, but that's a different study. Several of these writings bear the name of Peter. We have the Gospel of Peter, the Preaching of Peter, the Apocalypse of Peter, the Acts of Peter, the Epistle of Peter to Philip, among others. But because of the dates or the contents being too different to be located alongside the other letters we have attributed to Peter in the New Testament, we don't read them that often. The point is, it could be written by the Apostle Peter. It could be written by any number of other people who claim to be Peter. There's lots of writings attributed to Peter out there in some way or another. The only ones we have in Scripture for various reasons are 1st and 2nd Peter. Sometimes those reasons are we find them much later than when the Bible is put together. Sometimes their contents are just weird. And they were like, that doesn't seem right and biblical to want to chop people's legs off and feed them to cows. That's not in there, but similar. There's some weird stuff in some of these books. They're just like, that doesn't jive with Jesus. Like in the infancy Gospel of Thomas, you have Jesus turning his friends into goats. And it's kind of like, we don't really think that's Jesus. We're probably not going to put that in the Bible. So if 2 Peter 3 is referring to a letter now lost to us, the case isn't unique. For example, Paul wrote to the Corinthians in what we call his first epistle, I wrote to you in my letter, clearly referring to an earlier letter that we don't have. So what do these observations mean to us as we begin studying 1st and 2nd Peter together? One, we need to study each letter on its own, each having its own purpose and message. The message of 1 Peter isn't going to be continued, completed, explained, or modified in 2 Peter, nor does 2 Peter presuppose a knowledge of 1 Peter. They aren't lumped together in that way. Second, we need to know that it's all right to say, I don't know. Sometimes we just don't know. From the newest student of Scripture to the most accomplished biblical scholar, the readers of the letters probably knew exactly what the author was talking about, but we are not privy to all the details. Like with the example of no dogs in church, we don't know sometimes specific things the authors of any letter in the New Testament are always talking about, or even sometimes the phrasing in the Old Testament or New Testament. For example, there was a meme going around on Facebook this week that was funny, yet pretty accurate, true about how we understand Scripture. It goes like this. 2,000 years from now, people will probably not understand the difference between a butt dial and a booty call. That's why understanding Scripture is so hard. Think about it. 2,000 years, they sound like the same thing, but they aren't the same thing. Little phrasing. So we don't always have all those idioms known. That's why it's so important to study Scripture, to try to get the original context, because if you mess up those two, you might find yourself in a sticky situation. Same thing with the Bible. If we think it means one thing, but we don't have all the information, we can end up going down the very wrong way. So here's an example by Fred Craddock, a letter he writes in his commentary on these books. It says, Dear Harry, we are hoping Frank will be released by the weekend. Molly can hardly wait. The old gang is planning the usual party at Charlie's place. Please bring Tracy. See you there. Peggy. Seems straightforward, right? But Craddock points out that we do not know these people. We do not know who is in the old gang and what it is. Is it a group of friends or a criminal ring? We don't know. Are they going to go break into a bank? We don't know. Is Frank being released from the hospital, prison, or the military? Those are very different things. Is Molly his daughter or his dog or his girlfriend? We know none of this, so any attempts to interpret this letter necessarily are speculative in nature. But I'm guessing as I read it, you were automatically thinking certain things in your head. You might have thought, oh, he's going to be released from the hospital. We'll get an old group of friends together again. His wife's anxious to see him. And we think that because that's what maybe how we're used to talking. But we could be 180 degrees wrong. That's why it's important to read Scripture with humility. It's often dangerous when you see somebody so sure this is what the Bible means, and so you have to do this, live this way, vote this way, make this decision. That always worries me because we don't actually know. When we go to heaven, I guarantee each of us, when we finally get to meet Jesus, will realize we were wrong about a lot more things than we were right about. So always reading Scripture with humility to say, I think this is what it may mean, but leaving the door open to, I could be very wrong on this. It's when we think we're right, that sin of certainty that gets us in trouble, and the world in trouble so often. So when we read the letters of the Bible, we have to realize that we don't have all the details, so we need to be careful how we use them, especially if it's ever to exclude someone or say you're not good enough or you're being bad. We could be wrong and making someone else's life miserable because of our ignorance. We can't take every word said as prescriptive for all people in all times. So we'll examine these two letters closely, each on its own terms. We'll begin next week with kind of an introduction to 1 Peter before we begin to explore the text itself verse by verse. Questions, comments, snide remarks? Alrighty, I will see you next week.